Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session of our webinar of the Research Facility on Inequalities. I'm Manda David, Research Officer with IFD and the Scientific Coordinator of the facility. This program, funded by the EU and implemented by IFD, comprises of more than 20 research projects, and we have launched this webinar series in order to present some of the results. We are therefore inviting you to join us every Monday at 5 p.m. Paris time and talk about inequality in connection with various topics such as taxation, social protection, education, labor markets, and capabilities. Just before we start, a few guidelines on the webinar. As you can see, there's a questions feature at the right of the screen, where you can type your questions. The panelists will answer them after their presentation, but one of them can answer any clarification questions that might arise during the presentation. All the questions are public, and you can vote for those that you think are more relevant. After the presentation, I will select a few of them, and I will address them to our speakers. Given the significant number of participants from Latin America for this session, we have decided that you can also ask your questions in Spanish, and I will translate them into English. And similarly, if there is time, our speakers can answer some of the questions both in English and Spanish if they think it's relevant. Finally, the webinar is recorded and the replay will be available. And for those of you who could not join us for the previous sessions, you can find online on our webpage in the events section the replays of the two previous sessions, which were very engaging, one on perceptions of inequality and social mobility in Mexico, and another one on inequality in earnings over the life course in South Africa. Today we have two panelists, Sarah Boton from IFD and Patricia Urqueta from CIDES-UMSA, who will be presenting their joint work on inequality related to urban water services in Bolivia. Welcome, Sarah and Patricia. You have the floor. And I will just put on your presentation.
It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to share this research project in paper with you. Regarding the context, we start recognizing socioeconomic inequalities constitute, along with climate change, one of the main challenges of our time. Income inequality continues to expand, as well as fragmented metropolitan areas, increasing the gap in access to the city and its services. Thus, more and more inhabitants live in a more and more unequal world. We know in a lot of literature, Latin America has been recognized as the region of the world with the greatest inequality. Although this painful characteristic seems to be gradually decreasing under the impulse of voluntarist public policies and improvements in economic conditions, inequality as revealed fact and civil perception persists. As many authors maintain, beyond vertical inequalities, large cities also tend to concentrate the greatest spatial inequalities. That is, inequality does not come down to income. It is rather a complex dynamic where the process of social production of urban space becomes key to understand the limits of public policies and the need to re-problematize the city and its place in the reproduction of inequality. I am now paraphrasing Ramiro Segura. Despite difficulties, urbanization process and population growth, access to water in urban areas has shown major improvement in the past 2 decades, as the SDGs demonstrate. Official data informs that in Bolivia, 92.8% urban dwellers have access to water services. But Data may also hide many other structural and emerging inequalities and do not properly reflect social reality when it comes to analyzing in depth inequalities related to water services for two reasons that are very articulated. A methodological reason, official definition of access to water by the joint monitoring program that follows the SDGs between United Nations and the World Health Organization, consider actually access to improved water sources, for instance, domestic connection to water tap, but also access to improved water source, provided collection time is not more than 30 minutes for a round trip, including queuing, for example, standpipes. Within this double category, social practices to effectively have access to water are very unequal. According to these official indicators, both those that have a water tap at home and those that have to walk 30 minutes count as improved water sources. There is no difference. So there is an inequality in the way access to water service is registered. And the conceptual reason. In the scientific literature, inequalities related to water access always refer to connection or non-connection to water services. We consider that there are many more types of inequalities related to water services that should be addressed, analyzed better, and integrated in the sectoral research and political agenda. In this project and in this paper, we concentrate in the conceptual reason. We aim not to measure inequality in the access to water service, but to analyze it. The water crisis occurred between November 2016 and January 2017 in La Paz that showed the complexity of the problem through its multiple dimensions, consequences of climate change, governance problems, profound relation between water as a resource and as a service, and drew a different map of the inequalities in the city because the scarcity struck this time, especially in the southern area, where sectors of the upper middle class live, also operated as a clear reference of this conceptual reason. The research program on urban inequalities related to water services in the cities of La Paz and El Alto was led by the Postgraduate Center for Development Sciences from the Universidad Mayor de San Andrés, CIDES UMSA, and gathered a multidisciplinary research team with expertise and or background on political economy, sociology, and urban studies. Of 8 researchers, 3 of them senior and 5 junior researchers, and produced in total 8 papers, a conceptual paper, an historical analysis, and 6 thematic papers based on fieldwork deployed in several zones of the cities of La Paz and El Alto. So, as this scheme shows, to better understand and report on inequalities related to urban water service, the investigations were approached from different perspectives, applying a multidisciplinary dialogue based on a joint review of the state of art of the water issue in Bolivia, building a common theoretical framework and through qualitative research techniques. The research results were published in a book in Spanish that is currently being translated to English and presented during an international seminar organized in La Paz in March this year. Within the seminar, in the session dedicated to advocacy with local and national authorities, the 6 policy briefs produced out of the papers were presented. Different research topics appear as chapters in this mentioned book. An overview of inequalities in urban water services by myself and Sarah Bottom, which is the paper we are presenting now after this introduction. The urbanization of water in the city of La Paz, historical and conceptual perspectives by Juan Arbona, Territorial inequalities expressed in children's health in 2 neighborhoods with access to water in the city of El Alto by Malkia Tudela, persistence of inequality in access to water, and look at the actions of women in peri-urban territories of the city of El Alto by Jimena Escobar, landscape of springs and collective outdoor laundries in the city of La Paz by Jacqueline Davalos, corporate citizenship in water urbanization in the outskirts of El Alto by Victor Hugo Perales, when governance fails and institutional asymmetries in water management in the municipality of La Paz by Ariel Ferrufino, and conflict and tension over water ownership in the territory of the urban-rural interface of Hampaturi, municipality of La Paz by Scarlett Torrico. The paper presented today constitutes the conceptual framework of the program and was produced at the beginning of the research based on literature and previous fieldwork research, and it was updated and confirmed along the way with fresh research results from the field. Now I will let Sarah to continue with the presentation of the paper.
Thank you, Patricia. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. As Patricia mentioned, the purpose of the paper is not to measure inequalities related to water services, but rather to question the measures and to go beyond figures in order to discuss categories and identify and describe types of inequalities. So among the multiplicity of situations of inequality related to water we observed in La Paz and El Alto, we identified at least 10 situations that can be gathered in 4 types of inequalities. The first one being access to the main network, then situations related to inequalities between users. A third category has to do with off-grid inequalities, and the last type to perceived inequalities. The first type is related to actual access to the public network, meaning EPSA's network. EPSA's is the water operator for both cities of La Paz and El Alto with a united technical system. So situation number 1. The first situation of inequality regarding the service is between those who do have access to the main network and those who don't. A map of spatial inequalities in the city can easily be drawn on that basis. This map namely constitutes what is called the service area of the water operator. This service area can be divided between area already served and area to be provided with the service. As Patricia mentioned in introduction, in Bolivia, according to the official figure, almost 93% of the urban population in the country has access to water. But this figure hides very strong disparities between Bolivian cities and between districts within the cities, and also between types of service. So the second type of inequality we identified was inequalities between users. Because among the users that we could call the privileged ones, because there are people that, yes, do benefit from access to the main network, there are in fact several types of inequalities. We identified 3 of them. Situation 2. The second situation of spatial inequality depends on the location of the home and has to do with the quality of the service. It can sometimes be extremely penalizing. For instance, when someone lives in a place located at the end of the network and has very low pressure or experience difficulty in continuous supply, sometimes there can be also difficulties due to the topography of the neighborhood. The poor quality of the service may compel users of the public service network to complement their service with alternative solutions, and this means additional costs. Situation 3. The third situation of spatial inequality, also depending on the location of the home, has to do with the vulnerability of the system, that is to say, the technical system. In this category, we find the users served by the network, but who suffered or may suffer episodes of supply shortages in times of crisis. The typical example, already mentioned by Patricia, is that of the water crisis that occurred in La Paz at the end of 2016. The crisis was a direct consequence of both natural and technical factors: climate change, drought, empty dam, mismanagement, and communication problems. And the result was 94 districts of the city deprived of water services for several weeks. Although the fragility of the system had been studied previously, in 2008 a landslide had caused a major shortage, the 2016 crisis plays a much more powerful trigger role, as it drew a totally different map of the inequalities in the city, since it affected users of the middle class and upper class living in the southern area of La Paz. And those people had never experienced lack of water service before. So between aging and weakening of large systems, service management problems, and increase in drought episodes due to climate change, this supply crisis questioned the resilient capacity of the large agglomerations and contribute to a new reading of spatial inequalities in the city. Situation number 4, regarding inequalities between users of the public network. The fourth situation of inequality we identified is a vertical one, as it is related to revenues and to the ability to pay. When it comes to paying for the service, many users may have difficulties, whether it is for paying the cost for connection to the network or for paying the bill for water consumption. Operational responses to this type of inequality, often through the support of international cooperation, tend to place greater emphasis on service subsidy solutions to pay for connection fees, as they are considered more effective. About tariff structure and regulation, there are many debates about policy options, but progressive tariff structures can constitute an answer. The main problem being that in practice, the price of water is still very often used as a political tool. In Bolivia, imposing a rate freeze during the Morales government resulted in the non-viability of financing for the expansion of the network. So now, after having presented 3 situations of inequalities among users of the public service, we will now extend this category of users to users of other kind of water services. Situation number 5 is related to both spatial and horizontal inequality and is related to the type of operator. Some people who do not benefit from access to the public network may find the presence of an alternative operator in their sector. This is, for instance, the case of area which location, proximity, and accessibility to alternative water sources may allow some kind of supply organization. The service in this case is not provided by the public company, but by a small operator, a cooperative or local water committee. This phenomenon varies greatly from city to city. For instance, in Cochabamba, which has a strong tradition of self-management of water, there's a multiplicity of small systems, as studied by Juan Cabrera. While in the case of La Paz, with the extension of the borders of the metropolis, the latest research, led by Coupeau and Le Will, show a progressive disappearance of small systems, especially in the southern part of the city, in the urban-rural strip, where the public service is gradually arriving. But in some areas in La Paz with a high topographic gradient, such as the slope of the Cotahuma district, the smallest and most numerous systems show a certain capacity for resilience, since the public service can only serve the main street of these areas that are declared non-buildable. In these hillside districts, water services are provided by small committees or cooperatives with very different criteria than the public service. Direct supply of underground resources, a simple technical system, a flat rate not related to water consumption, and generally quite low, such as 2 Bolivianos per month, and a strong direct participation of the users required for work of collective interest, like cleaning of tanks, digging of trenches, etc., which implies the discipline in participation with the neighborhood and the community. Here, the reading in terms of inequality is more ambivalent. In comparison with the users of the public service, the inhabitants of these districts have lower service quality. They benefit from a very low price for water, but instead they must dedicate time and personal energy to collective work. Situation number 6 is dealing with the inequality due to differential treatment of customers on the part of the provider. Regardless of the service provider, it can be a private entrepreneur, cooperative, or even the official operator, users of water services may face inequality related to commercial treatment, with possible abusive practices from the operator. This type of inequality is often more blatant in the case of private providers that apply unregulated tariffs. A typical situation of abuse is that of crisis context, where water carriers, for instance, lend themselves to competition among users. But it can also be described in cases where regulation is self-managed, which makes the field more favorable to abuse. An example of this is in the case of a water cooperative in Mayasa in District 22 of La Paz, a mixed area with luxurious homes and very high rents, and also very modest homes, where the neighbors with high purchasing power are willing to pay high rates, high charges for good service, forcing the poorest households to pay a very high price compared to their family budget. So after this panorama of inequalities between users, we will now present the third type of inequality related to water services. The third type of inequality we studied, called off-grid inequalities, refers to situation of inequalities for people who do not benefit from any kind of water service. Situation number 7, inequalities due to the proximity or not of an alternative water source. The main difficulty for those who are off the grid lies in the fact that in the absence of an individual alternative supply, like wells or access to groundwater, which means of available and accessible water in their territory, these inhabitants suffer what ILO calls the double penalty for being poor, called also the poverty penalty, because they are obliged to buy water at a higher price than the public service, despite being generally poorer than network users. Some researchers have been interested in these aspects, for example, through the concept of water justice, developed by Strong, Allen, etc. Situation number 8 refers both to spatial and horizontal inequality and is related to the institutional affiliation or not to a district committee or to any kind of influence social political organization. For the people living in the areas that are waiting for the upcoming arrival of the water network, being affiliated or not to a district committee constitutes a situation of inequality. The water operator's response time to take into account the request will highly depend on the social pressure that can be expressed. For example, this is the case of the city of El Alto, which is experiencing very rapid urban growth. According to the water operator itself, responses are faster and more efficient when requests come from certain districts where the potential for social mobilization is known and feared, as studied by Juan Arbona. Situation number 9 is the one referring to gender. The people not connected to any water service suffer horizontal inequalities related to gender more than the users of the public service. In terms of health, women and children are the categories that suffer the most from lack of access to drinking water. In terms of decision-making and division of tasks, although men and women assume responsibilities with regard to water, and despite the evolution observed in the last 10 years, the gender division of labor continues to be significant and tends to give men a role of control and decision, and women a role linked to the collection or negotiation of water in the use and consumption, and in the management and care of the resource in the domestic space, as studied by Escobar. After having presented inequalities between users as well as off-grid inequalities, we will now present the last type of situation of inequalities, which is the one of perceived inequalities, that does concern both connected and not connected people. Finally, situation number 10. Finally, we identified a more subjective category that cannot be ignored because of its major influence on policy processes, which is the one of perceived inequalities. The notion of perception refers to various situations. On the one hand, there are perceived inequalities compared to real inequalities or to observable inequalities. For example, some residents of the southern area of La Paz do not connect to the public service network because they believe that the users of El Alto pay less for water and consider it unfair and a great inequality of treatment. Although these social representations may be very far from reality, they are decisive for the operation of a public service, which is by definition based on trust, on users' trust. On the other hand, is the old debate on social justice and inequalities perceived as fair. This is where the discussion over equity and equality takes place. And this debate happens in all research on human societies and policy building around concepts like general interest, public interest, or common interest, that according to periods, regimes, and contexts usually change. So perceived inequalities give rise to debates, for example, on the fair price of water, on redistributive policies, on the issues of solidarity tariffs, on territorial compensation, etc. This last type of inequality invites us to a more subjective reading. The perceived inequalities play a major role in the acceptance of the terms of the social contract offered by the water service, whether it refers to the public service or to an alternative service. Now that we presented the whole scheme of situations of inequalities, that is, of course, very specific to the territory we studied, that is to say the cities of La Paz and El Alto, it would be quite a different scheme in other urban contexts. We would like, before concluding, to highlight some elements we find crucial for using this conceptual tool. First of all, it is important to remind that all the situations of inequalities we presented have been studied in many dedicated research, sometimes with very different disciplinary and methodological approaches, and that is essential to try and connect and combine all those research avenues. This implies articulating three dimensions. The first one being research objects. For instance, research on water resources and research on water services are still very isolated academic fields. The second has to do with research disciplines in order to study new interfaces. For example, understanding the 2016 water crisis in La Paz implied to connect research on climate change and water resources, technical system, infrastructure risks associated, social practice, and political affiliations. The third dimension has to do with research scales. Most of the fieldwork research is based on a territorial analysis that can be focused either on a neighborhood or a district or a city, and this calls both for comparison and for articulation. Second point, each situation of inequalities we describe, most of the time, reflects in existing instruments for public action, either designed by water operators or public authorities or by the civil society. So this complete reading of situation of inequalities can constitute an opportunity to also inform and discuss articulation of instruments of public policy. And the third point is directly linked to points 1 and 2. In order to articulate both research avenues and public action, it's essential to have a comprehensive dynamic view of the situation of inequalities, because of course, they're not defined for once and they do interact. For instance, some inequalities can disappear while solving others. For example, developing extended access to the public network tends to directly undercut off-grid inequalities. But we will also have to resolve problems caused by competing inequalities. Some inequalities may disappear while worsening others. For instance, developing extending access to the public network can increase inequalities in ability to pay for the service, for instance. As a conclusion, we would like to insist on 4 ideas. First, inequalities related to urban water services should not be considered only through the lens of spatial inequalities and of access to the main network. Second, there are many other dimensions of inequalities, including vertical and horizontal, to consider and include in the water research agenda. Third, each research avenue is very specific to the territory, as water is a local resource. Also, water services have high environmental and technological implications linked to the configuration of the territory, as well as very strong sanitary and social implications linked to the social groups living in this territory. This implies a strong need for local-rooted field research. And lastly, the main research challenges we identified are 2. First, to consider interactions and dynamics between all the types of inequalities we described in order to inform complementary and prioritized public policies. Second, to link the water research agenda to neighboring topics as health, housing, or climate change, for instance. The current situation due to the COVID pandemic is showing that the nexus between water, housing, hygiene, and health, for instance, grew rapidly to stand in the top agenda of policies, and this should reflect in articulated research programs. Thank you very much for your attention and for your questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I don't know if Patricia would like to come back on stage. Until now, there haven't been any questions, but I think that there might be some that will arise with the discussion, and I have some questions myself. Thank you, both of you, for this very rich presentation. Of course, the economist in me longs for some precisions on more quantifiable topics, but I will try to refrain. However, I would be very interested maybe knowing how correlated is the water inequality that you observe to economic inequality, and whether you can say a few words on that. And then also have this idea of the fair price of water that you also mentioned in the perceptions can impact the strategies of the alternative operators, and whether there are already things that are implemented in order to see how the price they propose can be matched to this fair price of water. And I have a couple more questions I could ask afterwards.
I don't know, Patricia, if you want me to answer both questions, or maybe I can begin with the fair price of water and then go to water inequality and economic inequality, and maybe you can complement this one, Patricia, if you okay. Actually, the thing of alternative water operators is that they are not regulated. They are not part of the regulation of the sector. So the definition of the price is really stuck to the conditions of the service, and as I mentioned, more than the demand from the users or the capacity of the users. And as I mentioned, at least in the city of La Paz, in the Cotahuma district, the technical systems are very, I would say, light or very simple technical systems, and the water produced is coming from natural sources from the territory, from the place. This allows very low price for those operators, because it's a very small local scale, because they do not have treatment plants. They do treat the water with chlorine, but it's not very costly. And because, of course, they do not pay for what I mentioned, collective work. So people might have very low fare for water, but at the same time, on Sundays, all the families should go and participate to collective work. That's why I mentioned the fact that it's more ambivalent to speak about inequalities in the case of small water systems, because you don't necessarily have an economic contribution. It's also very physical and social contribution to the service. And the debate on fair price goes, of course, is not specific to La Paz and El Alto, and we would find in each citizen or each customer different vision of what is a fair price for water. In many contexts, we see that people do have a connection to phone services, for instance, and they pay much higher price for this than for water. And at the same time, water is a much more basic services and essential service for health and life. But as they're not within the regulation of the big system, their prices are not really connected to the demand. About water inequality and economic inequality, I think the complexity of the scheme we presented, which has many dimensions, we really would need to address this question within each category of the inequality we presented. And the answer would not necessarily be the same if we talk about people who do have access or people who do not have access to the service. If we're talking about gender or political affiliation, then the dimension of economic is more through social groups and location of people in the city. So as we try to show, water inequality has got so many dimensions that we should maybe stick to one of these dimensions to answer this question of comparison with economic inequalities. Maybe Patricia? Yeah.
I would like to just answer in a few lines to the first question about the correlation of the water inequalities with the economic inequalities. We did not have such a correlation as a category of analysis, but we do know there is a relation, a vinculation of the base because of the pay of services, basic services. I would go on the other way around to say that these inequalities to access to the water services and other services, and because of the struggling of the families to access to water, and in using a lot of the economies, the salaries in the family economies to respond to basic needs. So accessing to water services or may have an impact in the family's economy. So I would say there is it would be also very interesting to learn and to know, to realize that because of the difficulties to access to water, the family economies have an impact, because there's so many families that pay, as Sarah said, much more for this service than the the service that the most of the population have to pay. So I just wanted to underline that relation between those inequalities.
Great, thank you so much. I think we already have two interesting questions. One, which is on the percent of the population which is connected to the public network, and whether among these people there are any differences of price between the neighborhoods or by levels of income.
Okay. The percentage of population connected to the public network varies a lot from one city to another. The figure we presented, the GMP figure, 93%, is really, as Patricia showed, gathering many types of different social practices, or at least a configuration of access to water. Within the city of La Paz, I don't have the exact number. I'm not sure EPSAS communicated the exact numbers. Patricia, maybe you could confirm that. In La Paz, it's quite the figure is quite high, connection to the public service. As we mentioned, the alternative operators are disappearing because of the extension of the actual service. In El Alto, there are still many people and districts to be connected, and it's this number also follows the urban extension. So in terms of population, as the frontiers of the city and the number of inhabitants is not fixed, the percentages are evolving, but it would be more than 90% in La Paz and El Alto. In terms of tariff and prices, no, there is no difference by neighborhoods. This kind of tariff scheme is applied, for instance, in Colombia, in the city of Bogota, where they identify different districts and prices for public services vary. Now, in the case of La Paz and El Alto, the tariff scheme is what we call the progressive tariff structure by level of consumption. Under a certain volume of consumption, people pay what we call the social tariff, which is the very low rate. And then the more people consume water, the more they pay. Meaning people who do have swimming pool in the southern part of the city would pay much higher bills than people who are just using water from the tap for domestic uses. So this is the whole debate on equity for water tariffs, but the choice has been made since the 90s to have this structure by volumes of consumption, and this reflects más o menos in the social practices of. The idea is that it should be reflecting the social practices of the inhabitants. But we, of course, know that also numerous families consume more water, etc. But higher volumes of consumptions do correspond also to certain habits, like cleaning the car or having a swimming pool, for example.
Patricia, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, again, just something very small. I would say that due to institutional situation we have with the water service, there has been very different kinds of difficulties to access to official data because of the situation we have since 12, 13 years ago with the main enterprise that has to do with the water service. So the main source of information in the past years has been the field work. So we have just this data that Sarah shared that says that almost 93% of the population is has the connection to the main network. In La Paz, seems to be a little bit higher, up to 95%. But as Sarah said, we have to understand that one thing is the urban registration, and the peri-urban will have less connection. And then you also have the new settlements. So as she said, there's always an evolving situation with what the connection can be like. And we did have the fields that we decided and we selected for our studies have to do with cases on these peri-urban areas. That's why there's this emphasis on the collection of data on cases and these interactions and identification of inequalities.
Thank you so much. And I see that Arigato Rufino, who is one of your co-authors, has also brought some elements of response in the questions feature. And there are also two questions on the interactions between inequalities and the way you conceptualized these various levels of interaction. So maybe you could go through the explanation of how you approached the interactions between the various inequalities. I don't know if you would like me to put the scheme that you had in your slides maybe back on.
Yeah, maybe. Thank you, Anda. I would begin, but then Patricia, please, if you can complement with all the work that was done by the team. Really, this conceptual scheme we're presenting today is the basis of what we set it at the beginning of the research, and more based not on previous fieldwork and also literature. So we identified it as a challenge to connect and study interactions. But within this project, what we did is to select some items and to go on the field and study on a territorial basis fieldwork in some parts of the city, what gender, how gender was related to water inequalities, institutional elements, etc. So for this research project, we had, as Patricia said, 6 fieldwork on different parts of the city and different topics. And the articulation was really developed during the international seminar with all the discussions between papers and also additional work from other colleagues. But we identify it as a challenge for further research to be working on interactions and to see how resolving one inequality could help resolve another or would worsen another. That was not the entrance, or that was not the ambition we had for this research project. But maybe, Patricia, you can complement with some research results from the project.
Referring to this, I would say again that today we selected the paper on the other types of inequalities to share with you, because we thought the main message we wanted to pass was that other than just the connection and non-connection, there's so many other inequalities that can be found that we can draw from the reading, also from the literature, and from a very accurate reading and observing of in the terrains, and that we thought that was, and we made out of that the introduction to the book that gathers a group of the other researchers we made. So we thought that was something we could share with you. And as Sarah said, that has to do with the revision of literature and also in a dialogue with the outcomes of the researchers. But since we had also at the beginning of the project this clarity that we wanted to go in detail and the selection and identification of cases that could give us more information on these other types of inequalities. So as a team, we started to, as preparing the state of art in that, we then went on to defining the terrains, the places, the spaces where we wanted to build those cases and find those cases. So one of the decisions was also to make sure the very different dimensions on the political one and the gender aspect of the situation and the political situation and the institutional, and also understand historically how this inequality situation on the water services had been going on. So we made sure that each one of the researchers did have an emphasis on these dimensions. So I would say that I would tell you that each one of those researchers has a lot of information on those terrains, on those cases that are referring and reflecting these different types of inequalities. So the interaction is in the method, at the beginning, in the way of we designed the work of the whole project, and then each one of them has its own article in the book and its own information on the findings. I don't know if that shows a little bit of where the interactions can be as well.
Thank you to both of you. We still have a few minutes. There is a question that, well, I'm definitely not an expert on this issue, so I didn't understand it, but maybe it's due to my lack of expertise. Freddy on the access and chance climatic and balance, and maybe its evolution today. So I don't know if one of you have understood that question, or if not, if the person who asked it could rephrase it maybe. And if not, I want to take the opportunity of having the scheme here, because when you've presented it, you said that this could be different in different contexts. And I would be quite interested to know what you think might actually appear or disappear from the scheme in other contexts, and which those contexts could be also. I mean, do we talk about more densely populated areas, or yeah, so what are the other contexts? How can this be different in terms of inequality?
Okay, thank you for this question, and we hope that this first proposal we have for the context of La Paz and El Alto can be used and completed with other research in other contexts, of course. We were thinking, for instance, we have quite a unified in La Paz and El Alto public service, meaning all users having access to the public service really use domestic tap. In other contexts, for instance, I'm thinking of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. You also have from the public service different options, technical options. For instance, standpipes with people. You can have either water at home or go and have water on and buy water from a standpipe with water from the public service. So that would be a different price, but that would also need you to carry the water, etc. So it's a different kind of use. And this did not appear at all because it's not really comparable to the situation of La Paz. I studied the water system in Buenos Aires, and also there were in the city of Buenos Aires, many people have access to individual wells. Well, depending, and that's why we insisted on the specificity of the territory, depending of availability of water resources, depending on the policy of the water operator, depending on sometimes municipalities have extra technical solutions they give for inhabitants. depending on the institutional environmental context, options can be very different. And that would reflect in the type of inequalities that we study. But I think we would always have this difference between having access or not to the public network, and of course all the difficulties for people who do not access to the network. Presence of alternative sources will also be a major issue. Gender, I'm afraid, will always be a major issue. And for instance, the weight of affiliation to neighborhood council or political organization may vary from a context to another, for instance.
And I would add to what Sarah just said, depending where the source of water is, for instance, how close it is, and what's the relation that the population may have with the sources. I would say that in certain contexts, in certain places, maybe the source of the water is something that has to do only with the authorities, with the government. But in other places, such as in Bolivia, the source of water can be very close and be part of the territories of communities that live and are part of those territories where the water sources are. So depending on the political situation, on the social situation, the water agenda can be on and off, depending on what's the situation, and if that has to be part of the politicization of the moment, say, in a way. And maybe also showing a bit of context, I would just use a minute to read out what Ariel Ferrufino, that's been here, that he's here with us, had some answers to do about the cost of the service. I'm reading his messages. In Bolivia, he says, the price of the service is regulated by political criteria. The central state having connection problems. Again, in Bolivia, the price of the service is regulated by political criteria. The central state established a public policy focused on the poorest. This does not allow an increase in the rate, which has prevented service providers from expanding their coverage by itself. The cost of the service is so low that they cannot expand their services. So they have to go to the central state to receive public investments. This has to do with their provision, but I just wanted to read that because it also has to do with a specific context. Yeah.
Okay, so a huge thank you to all of you. We're reaching the end of our webinar. Thank you for your presentations, and a huge thank you also to all of our participants. Next week, we'll be talking about how the delivery of public services shapes attitudes towards taxation in a sub-Saharan context, however. So we also welcome you to join us next week at the same time. And again, thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anda. Thank you, everybody.